Welcome back to Week 2 of Dragon Ball Dissection December, the Dragon Ball Dissection month-long marathon. Today we're here to continue our look at the television adaptation of the Freeza Arc. Up until now, I've primarily focused on the first half of this arc. If you watched my recent video on Season 3 of American DBZ, you'll know that for myself, despite not having watched the dub in years, it's still difficult for me not to see a hard dividing line in the middle of the Freeza Arc. And while that shift in dub elements, the change in voices and music for example, contributes significantly to that, the show itself does change too. It's that turning point I referred to last time. See, even when I was 13, I knew that the show was being dubbed from Japanese, and that this break was nothing more than a pause in the dubbing of an already existing show, not an actual production gap. However, despite that, when I tuned into Season 3, I almost convinced myself there had actually been a break in the creation of the show. The art, the animation, the coloring, the filler, it all suffered a huge drop in quality, and that happened to almost exactly coincide with the shift between US Seasons 2 and 3. Now that I know all the different animation studios and have a keener eye for this sort of thing, I can see the division is not nearly as clear-cut as I thought then. There were plenty of bad-looking episodes before, and many good-looking episodes after. But I don't think I was terribly off the mark. I don't claim to be an expert when it comes to the production of Dragon Ball. In the grand scheme of things, there's not a whole lot of behind-the-scenes info we know. And I certainly don't claim to be an expert when it comes to the field of animation. The following are simply my observations and the conclusions I've drawn from them. Over the years, I have briefly introduced you to the various animation studios responsible for Dragon Ball. For most of that run up until now, there were 6 regular teams: Studio Junio, Last House, Shindo Pro, Segasha, Studio Live, and the unnamed team led by freelancer Aoshima Katsumi. That generally meant a 6-episode rotation. In other words, each studio had about 6 weeks in between each of their episodes airing. As I mentioned last time in the Saiyan arc, after episode 30, Aoshima stopped working on episodes and began drawing exclusively for the movies, leaving the show with 5 teams by the beginning of the Freeza arc. 1990, which is when the Freeza arc started airing, introduced the trend of releasing not 1 but 2 Dragon Ball Z movies every single year. I've already observed that starting in Dragon Ball Z, most of the new music Kikuchi Shunsuke composed was created for the movies and simply recycled into the series. He was being called on to score 2 movies a year. I feel something similar happened to the animators. A lot of the series animators worked on the movies. It certainly appears to me as though the extra workload pulled focus away from animating the series well to animating the movies well. Studio Junio, which in my opinion was responsible for some of the highest quality episodes, was supervised by Maeda Minoru. He was also the series' character designer, and he was credited as animation supervisor for all 4 movies released during this arc, which I have to imagine caused him to be much busier. Let me give you an example here. Studio Junio worked on episode 48. They wouldn't do an episode again until 70. In fact, out of the 72 regular episodes of this arc, Studio Junio only animated 7 of them. As a point of comparison, the notoriously bad Studio Live, whose supervisor also drew key animation for certain movies, animated 14 episodes. Let's also remember that the Bardock special aired as a double-length episode during this arc, which also required extra care. But at least that pushed back production of the next regular episode by an extra week. Toei Animation would pick up some of the slack and animate a few episodes in-house. Their fantastic Nakatsuru Katsuyoshi would supervise the animation on the Bardock special. But essentially by the middle of the Frieza arc, the main studios had gone from a 6-episode rotation to a 4-episode rotation. Aoshima was gone from the series, Studio Junio largely was. That left Studio Live, Last House, Shindo Pro, and Segasha to do their work in 2/3 of the time they were used to having. I don't have to be an expert in animation to wager that that probably has a lot to do with the drastic dip in quality we get here. As if that wasn't enough, right around that coincidental Season 2, Season 3 break, which again only applies to the American version, not to the actual production of the show, Takeuchi Tomekichi stepped down as animation supervisor for Segasha. For the rest of the series, Shimanuki Masahiro and Hisada Kazuya would alternate supervising duties for that studio. And while ultimately Segasha came out the other side of this looking, in my opinion, better than ever, there were some definite growing pains that had to be worked out at this critical juncture. I mean, geez, look at episode 87! It's a fairly ambitious looking episode, but I don't understand how you can consistently draw Goku so wrong. And wouldn't you know it, episode 68, which comprised a decent chunk of the first episode of US Season 3, was the first Segasha episode supervised by Shimanuki instead of Takeuchi. And the character models really do look off. 13-year-old me can take comfort in that fact. You weren't crazy, you really did notice something. Shindo Pro and Last House, I would say, both had difficulties adapting to the angular shift in Toriyama's art, particularly the latter. Their softer, less detailed style just does not mesh well with these designs. This is where Last House starts to go downhill, but it doesn't really reach its nadir until after the Freeza Arc, so I'll focus on them in later videos. While Shindo Pro still holds up pretty well, I feel they somewhat overcompensate on the angular thing, leading to the nickname I used to hear them being called on the internet, the Evil Eye Studio. For their lowlights, I'm particularly reminded of episode 73, which isn't a bad-looking episode, but it flat-out reuses whole sections of animation. Studio Live generally remains as bad as it ever was. However, I think it's the only studio that starts to show any real improvement. While Ebisawa Yukio continues to supervise the studio, you can really easily tell the difference between sections he animated and sections drawn by his other key animators. When the chins and shoulder pads and boots stop looking ridiculously pointy, you know it's not Ebisawa drawing it. And while it's still not my favorite style, I can much more easily tolerate Studio Live during these cuts. Suffice it to say, I think pretty much every studio suffered at this point, and it really shows. It's so sad because, as I said last time, I thought the quality really jumped when they relaunched the series. Everyone was putting in their A-games. But by 1991, even when episodes were drawn okay, there was a rough, unpolished look to some of them. I hate to sound cynical, but it feels like they knew what they had. The Freeza Arc was when the Dragon Ball manga was most popular. They wanted to capitalize and crank out as much Dragon Ball Z material as they could. It didn't matter that they were spreading their resources thin on non-serialized movies. The show was just a merchandise commercial. It was still going to be popular even if the art and animation quality took a nosedive, because the real money was in ticket sales, right? That said, there is one section of the latter half of the Frieza arc that looks exceptionally good, better than the rest of the series. And that's not because of what's drawn, but how it's presented. For whatever reason, a handful of episodes, 73 to 80 I believe, were shot on 35mm film. Normally, Dragon Ball was filmed on smaller 16mm, and the bump in resolution resulted in those episodes looking remarkably sharper, and unless I'm mistaken, its colors more vibrant. But now back to my ranting. The art taking a significant hit was bad enough, but this is also where the pacing becomes unbearable. To an extent, I can understand. Remember, the show always had to stay behind the manga. That's what it was adapting. And over time, that buffer room had dwindled. Let's break this down for a second. When the Dragon Ball animated series began, the manga had a head start of 63 chapters, or about a year and 3 months. Skipping ahead to the beginning of the TV Piccolo arc, that lead had been cut in half to 28 chapters, or 7 months. Jumping once more to the episode in which Goku becomes a Super Saiyan, that had dwindled to a paltry 11 chapters, less than 4 months between page and screen. I remember starting DBD TV back in 2014, and following along with the manga for the first time, it amazed me in hindsight how quickly they were pacing everything, adapting multiple chapters in a single episode, and how much that would change in a few short years. Still, it's hard to blame them to an extent. In 1986, they had no idea how long this series would run. I maintain Dragon Ball fundamentally changed in the Freeza arc, and in a way that made it more difficult for adaptation to television. This was the longest arc Dragon Ball had ever done up to this point. Unlike the Saiyan arc, there was no big built-in gap for storytelling with a natural character arc to develop, and opportunities to reintroduce large portions of the cast. The story just kept running and running and running with fewer and fewer opportunities for organic expansion of the story. The focus fully turned to months upon months of non-stop fighting and transformations. A 15-page manga chapter is usually typically less material than would fill a half-hour block of television, but an entire chapter that's nothing but fighting can be set to animation that takes up a matter of seconds. And once the fighting started, there were fewer opportunities to cut away to other things. For example, they would always use natural breaks in the story to create their own filler storylines, but you can't really do that in the middle of a continuous fight in the middle of a very long story arc. Even long tournaments had gaps in between matches that offered opportunities for new material. Here, they were stuck between a rock and a hard place. They weren't in a position where they could stop bleeding material to adapt, but they couldn't let themselves get any closer to the manga than they already were. So by the late Freeza Arc, chapters were almost literally being adapted at a 1-to-1 ratio. As in, one chapter would comprise one episode, no matter how little material it provided. They did their best with a handful of small story cutaways. It couldn't be anything significant enough that it would draw focus from the real story for too long. We get Captain Ginyu swapping bodies with Bluma, Yamcha and the others fighting the dead Ginyu members on Kaio's world, and Chi-Chi's futile attempts to get to planet Namek herself across 2 different spaceships. Oh, I suppose I should mention that results in manga cutaways to Chi-Chi and Yajirobe and their own environs being dropped as they're hanging out at Capsule Corporation in the TV series. But yeah, that last one's the only one I don't particularly care for. If you can't get enough of Toei's Chi-Chi bitching everyone out for episode upon episode in a storyline that ultimately goes nowhere, this is what you've been waiting for. In fact, due to her casting change happening at around this time, you get to hear both Sho Mayumi and Watanabe Naoko's interpretations of Chi-Chi acting insufferably towards Bluma's family. At least the other 2 subplots have some kind of resolution and victory. Well, there is one big payoff for it I'll get to later. Ultimately, though, it's one gag as Chi-Chi chewing out Dr. Brief for not getting the ship ready quickly enough. I don't think these 2 characters ever interact in the manga, come to think of it. All the other characters stand around in the background. I do have a soft spot for the Ginyu at Kaio's. It makes no sense given that someone else was putting in filler cutaways of their dead bodies on Namek. You know, those bodies they simultaneously have in the afterlife. But it is nice to see these guys win a fight. I don't care too much about the supposed power scaling problem. My only complaint is how uncreative it is. I mean, you have the 2 strongest telekinetic fighters in the universe squaring off against each other, and what do the genius writers have them do? Headbutt each other. That was the only thing you could think to have Chaozu do? You give Chaozu a fight, and that's the only thing you could think to have him do. You bring back Gerdo, and he only uses his telekinesis to throw a tree at Kaio's house? You bring back Gerdo, and you don't even have him freeze time? Ah! While Captain Ginyu in Bluma's body is a fun enough diversion that makes further use of existing characters who aren't doing anything, it does feel like quintessential filler. Eventually, this pair makes their way to the fight. Piccolo, Gohan, and Kuririn become involved, the situation is resolved, and immediately the force of the fight between Goku and Frieza blows the 2 of them and only the 2 of them away, and none of the other characters care in the slightest or ever mention this again. Remember how in the 22nd Budokai, the TV series adds in all the absent characters as spectators? This feels like the exact opposite, like it was made to be cut out of the show as seamlessly as possible. Yet for some reason, years later, Dragon Ball Kai keeps this. Oh, but I guess it's important because the Ginyu Frog ends up on Earth and that becomes relevant again 24 years later in some crappy revival series. But I will take any number of cutaway filler plots to the show just dragging out the manga storyline. This content is stretched thinner than pantyhose over a sumo wrestler. There is taking time to set a tone, and then there's just killing time. Characters stare at each other. Kaio overexposits to Yamcha, Tenshinhan, and Chaozu. There is a full fight flashback at one point. They flash back to stuff we just saw. You're not going to believe this, but even the recaps get into this. The ironic part is that if this took place in the first Dragon Ball TV series, it might not have been as noticeable because there was no standard recap music. Dragon Ball Z introduced that. It's a very easy to follow Chala Head Chala based melody. In early episodes, the recap is pretty short. usually as long as the piece of music, and in some cases even shorter. As a point of reference, the full piece of music runs under 1 minute and 15 seconds. But starting here, you will be lucky to ever hear that piece of music without enduring sections of it looping, often multiple times. Yes, they had to resort to padding out the recaps to fill time. I timed at least one recap in this arc running longer than 3 minutes. That means if you were watching this as a kid in Japan, you'd have to sit through the nearly 2-minute long opening animation, the first commercial break, and then 3 minutes of recap just to get to the episode itself. I never again want to hear anyone complain my intros are too long. Thankfully, the next episode previews stayed locked at 30 seconds, otherwise I wouldn't be the least bit surprised if the actual episodes ended up being reduced to about 12 minutes long. This all culminates in Frieza's declaration of 5 minutes until Namek explodes, stretching itself out to a ludicrous 10 episodes. We're talking hours of your life here. It's ridiculous, and it forever cemented Dragon Ball Z's reputation as Drag On Ball because it does nothing but drag on and on. I sympathize with the situation they were in, but it is a pejorative that is well deserved here. Unlike a lot of people I hear from nowadays, I certainly don't think it ever gets to the point of being unwatchable. After all, I've watched it many times. That said, between the poor pacing and the declining animation quality, Dragon Ball Z reaches its absolute lowest point in the second half of the Freeza Arc. Whew! I can't believe I managed to devote an entire episode to that. Yet I still have more to say in regards to the Freeza Arc. I should have called this year's batch of episodes Freeza Dissection December. Check back next week as we continue our look at TV Frieza. And if you can't wait that long, it'll be waiting for you on Patreon soon, if it's not there already. Thank you to everyone who helps make this channel possible. See you next week!